Welcome everybody to Frogs, Bogs and Bushfire. How will Australian frogs survive climate change? To begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders, past and present. This morning's talk is part of a bigger program called the Climate and Environment Change Program. It's sponsored by Inspiring Victoria and is a collaborative program involving Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, the Royal Society of Victoria and Museums Victoria. In this program, we look at many of the Sustainable Development Goals, but particularly number 13, climate action. So how we can take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. We also today are looking at life on land, how we can protect, restore, promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems and prevent land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. The good news is that there are many ways to act on climate change, both personally at a small level in our families, in our communities, and in a larger way through our many broader groups, professional associations, local communities, businesses, banks, superannuation funds, and through government and international collaboration. In this program, we've also been looking at what this actually means in practice and thinking about the steps that we need to take. And here are a few of those written up in very simple ways to remind us of the different things that we can do, many different aspects of climate action. We know that climate change is already having an impact here in the state of Victoria in Southern Australia. The climate has already changed. It's hotter and drier with more fire danger, particularly in spring. And we experienced the effects of that in the big bushfires in 2019-20, which burnt large areas of the state. And here is a map showing the eastern portion of Victoria, where a large portion of Gippsland was burnt, as well as a significant area in the Alpine area. Earlier this month, Victoria's climate change strategy was released, and this gives a plan for how our state government is tackling the issues in terms of acting on climate change. And there are obviously many different aspects to this, but it is worth having a look at this climate change strategy because it puts out the opportunities and benefits of strong climate action, including new industries based on renewable energy, better outcomes for human health, and the provision of public services such as public transport, which benefit the community. So I'm not going to go in detail into all of those, but I do commend that you have a look at the strategy and see, I guess, to just really understand the transformation and the scale of transformation that is going on here and around the world to tackle climate change. But this morning, we do have a focus on climate change and on what it means for frogs. So today we're going to see the world through the eyes of frogs and what is important to them. And also to hear about how we can protect the environments that they live in. We've got three great speakers this morning. And so our first speaker is Dr. Jane Melville, and she is the Senior Curator of Terrestrial Vertebrates at Museums Victoria. Her research combines field-based studies on reptiles and amphibians to understand their evolution, genetics, ecology, and to use this information to support conservation. She's done extensive research on dragon lizards in Victoria and around the world. She also runs projects that are aimed at the conservation of endangered reptiles and frogs, such as grassland earless dragons and growling grass frogs. Today, she will tell us about work done investigating the impacts of bushfires on frog populations in Gippsland. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Kate. I'll just share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about work that we've been doing over about the last 5 years now on Gippsland frogs. Gippsland is a really important area in Victoria for frogs. Across Victoria there are 32 frog species. 15 of these are on the threatened species list, so almost half of Victoria's frogs are threatened. Gippsland in eastern Victoria has the highest diversity of frog species in Victoria, and 9 of them are threatened. So it's a really high proportion of Gippsland frogs that are threatened. So over the last 5 years, Dr. Joyce Sumner, who'll be talking a bit later, and Dr. Karen Rowe and I have been doing research on these frogs to look at their genetic health. And more recently, now we've started looking at how the bushfires have been impacting these species. So I'm going to talk about what we actually do out in the field. We go and look at these frog species out where they live. We look at their ecology and the habitats each of the different species needs to thrive. And we do this in a number of ways, and we did field work in 2017 and 2018, working in spring. We go and collect information on the habitats, the ponds where they breed, and we also do frog recordings. The calls frogs make during breeding season are really distinctive for each species, and it's a really good way of identifying what species are in an area. You can go out and record the frogs and later listen to it to work out what frogs are there. And Karen is going to talk about this in more detail a bit later. So I thought I'd just go through some of the frogs we find out in Gippsland. This is Perrin's tree frog. You can tell tree frog by the little cross pupil it has. You can see it's got a cross shape on its pupil. It's the only frog in Victoria that has that. It is very common in Gippsland, and when you're out in Gippsland, this in most of the ponds in breeding season in spring, this is the frog you're going to hear. And I've actually got some frog calls here to let you listen to it. So this is the Perrin's tree frog. Sometimes it's called the cackling woman frog. I think that's a little out of date, that name, but that's what it's called. So this is a very loud frog when it's calling, and it does has very big choruses, so it's quite a common frog to hear. This frog is one we are focusing work on in particular. This is the green and golden bell frog. It's a frog found up on the east coast of Australia. It's a large ground-dwelling frog. That it's a spectacular frog, but it's had really big declines in its distribution, and that includes its distribution in Gippsland. This is a map of Gippsland here, and the spots in blue are past known distributions, so before 1999. And then the green, red, yellow dots are the more recent distributions that we've found in our work and previous surveys done by the Department of Environment. And you can see from these coloured dots that there's been a really big decrease in the areas in which this frog has been found. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, habitat losses and habitat changes, and also a disease called chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus is a disease that's been impacting frogs globally, and this species in particular has been really quite significantly impacted by chytrid fungus. So we've been working on this species This is a picture of the variation you see. This one has very little of the gold and is mostly green. And I've got some sound of its call. So if you're out in spring and summer, you might hear it calling. Oh, again, press on the button. Now, this frog is sometimes called a motorbike frog. The call sounds a bit like a motorbike starting up. You can hear the cackling in the background, which is the parents. So that's a green and golden field frog. If you hear that motorbike calling at a pond, it's a green and golden field. This is the second species that we're really focusing our work on, the Martin's toadlet. This is a tiny little frog that's actually quite hard to find. It's distinguished by these really bright yellow patches on its thighs here. And this frog has very limited distribution. There's actually very few records of this in Victoria, and it's only found in Victoria. It's not found in any other state of Australia, and it's currently listed as critically endangered. When we went out and did fieldwork in 2017 and 2018, we were only able to find it at a handful of sites, about 4 sites across the whole of Crow National Park. So this is a species that we are focusing on and we're quite concerned about in regards to the bushfires. So we got some video footage of this little frog. It's only about 2 centimeters long. It's really quite small. It's probably the only video footage available of this frog. And it's very hard to hear this frog calling. It's a little squelching sound, and you've got to listen really carefully for it amongst all the really loud parents, tree frogs and marsh frogs that are calling. You've got to stand there listening for it. So I've got a recording here that has it. You've got to listen for a little squelching sound. Let's get this playing. There, that was it. That's it. That's it there. That's the call of the Martin's toadlet. You've got to sit there and listen for that amongst all these other frogs. And this is how we spend much of our time working on Martin's toadlet, sitting there listening for one little frog calling at a pond that sounds something like this. You've got to listen for a little squelching sound in all this. And this recording is actually recorded at this site here. So to the bushfires, all of you would know about the unprecedented fires during the 2019-2020 summer season. They were unprecedented because of their severity and their extent. Crow-Jinglong National Park, which is a large national park in eastern Gippsland, was severely impacted by them. 70% of Crow-Jinglong National Park was burnt. 10 Gippsland frogs were listed of immediate concern by the Department of Environment following the fires, with 8 of those species having more than 70% of their range impacted by the bushfires. And 5 species of these were of high or very high genetic risk. So the fires, it was believed that the fires would significantly impact the genetic diversity of the species. And we were particularly focusing on these genetic aspects. So just some pictures of what can occur. These photos were taken a few months after fires, and you can see regrowth is happening. But one of the problems with the frogs in these really severe fires is that it can actually burn the vegetation that occurs in the ponds, and many of the species, particularly the tree frog species, actually attach their eggs to vegetation in the ponds for successful breeding. So if the vegetation in and around ponds are burnt, it means that not only can the frogs be killed by the fire, but then their breeding season following the fires can be really impacted because they're not able to lay their eggs successfully. We mapped the severity of the bushfires across Croajingolong National Park and mapped sites that we have been studying frogs on top of that. And you can see that many of our sites are in the medium to high burn areas, and this is burn severity. These are the high severity burns, the ones where the tree canopy is burnt. So we're going to be going to these sites over the next number of years to assess how the frogs are doing following the bushfires, because we've been looking at them before the fires, now we can compare with after the fires. And I'm just finish up with a photo of probably my favourite frog that you get down in far eastern Gippsland, which is the leaf green river tree frog, which looks like someone's kind of put glitter gold stripes down its side. It really is a beautiful frog. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and Jo is going to take over now to talk about the conservation genetics.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's really fascinating. And I did enjoy imagining myself sitting by that pond and listening out for the different sounds of the frogs. That was wonderful.
And the mosquitoes.
And the mosquitoes. Oh, at least we didn't have any mosquitoes. If anyone in our audience online has questions for Jane, you can pop them into the question and answer space at the bottom of your Zoom controls. So if you think of something now that you'd like to ask her, pop it in there and we'll have a question session at the end. But you may want to catch that idea while you've got your question in your mind. Our next speaker is Dr. Joanna Sumner. She's a Senior Manager of Genetic Resources at Museums Victoria. She's worked in the fields of molecular ecology, population genetics and conservation biology, including work on the effect of rainforest fragmentation on the genetic diversity of reptiles in far north Queensland. She now manages the Ian Potter Australian Wildlife Biobank, which is a frozen tissue collection, and she also looks after the DNA labs with that. And she continues her research on topics ranging from conservation genetics of skinks to identifying the components of snake venom and to understanding populations of frogs in Victoria. So over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Kate. All right, now I'm going to share my screen. We'll see if we can get this happening as well. So I'm going to continue on talking about some of the work that Jane has been describing. So frogs, bogs and fire, but going to talk a little bit more about the importance of genetic diversity that Jane mentioned right at the end there. So, So with we do a lot of conservation research at Museums Victoria. So some of it is based in Victoria, but we also collaborate and do some other work in other parts of Australia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our field work and our conservation research and some of the collaborations that we're doing, and especially post these bushfires, because it's been an Australia-wide problem. So although this listening for frogs and watching the sunset is a really important part of our frog research, and probably some of the favourite, it's not just listening for frogs. There's also a lot of data collection, and this is a really important part of what we do. And so Jane mentioned a little bit about the data that we collect about the ecology of the frogs, but we also want to know that the species of the frog, how big it is, whether it's a male or a female, and all of this data is recorded. And we keep that connection between the animal that we might have in our hand and all of the data that we collect in our databases. And it's really important that we keep this data and that we can refer back to it. We don't know what we might need that data for in the future, but certainly these bushfires have been an important reminder that having data and continuing to collect data through time is really important, but I'll mention that again a bit. So again, some of the other data that we might collect when we're out in the field is testing for diseases, for wildlife diseases. In this case, we're doing a swab on a green and golden bellfrog for chytrid fungus. And this is this devastating disease that Jane mentioned before that has really damaged a lot of frog populations. And it's quite an easy test to do. It's to swab like an earbud along the skin of the frog. And then we take that swab back into the lab and release the frog. But we can still test whether there is chytrid in that population, and then we can keep an eye on where that chytrid might be. So keeping an eye on wildlife disease is another important piece of information that we gather when we're out in the field. And another really important thing that we might gather, we collect, and that is part of what I do, is a tissue sample. So when I talk about a tissue sample, I mean something that we can get DNA out of. So that might be a blood sample, or a feather from a bird, or a tail tip from a lizard, or a frog toe, or a little bit of webbing from a frog. And we can then store this tissue in one of our big cryo tanks, which keeps everything at minus 196 degrees. So it's so cold that everything in the cells stops moving. There's no chemical reactions going on in the cells anymore. And it means that DNA is preserved for possibly eternity. Maybe that's excessive. But it means that these tissue samples that we collect over time, every time we go out into the field, are then available for researchers actually around the world who are doing work on these species. So over the last 10, 20 years, as we've done our wildlife and ecology research, we've taken these little DNA samples and we've stored them, and we've stored their data, so we know exactly what's in there, and that is available for research projects that are coming up that may be working on one of these species. There's also the potential at this very cold temperature for us to preserve eggs and sperm and cell lines from wildlife, and that's something we're moving towards as well. So that's another string to our conservation bow, so that it may be that we can preserve eggs and sperm now and the genetic diversity that's in them, and then if the species that they're from then start to lose their genetic diversity in the wild, we may be able to use this stored egg sperm genetic diversity to help those species down the track. So this is our lab here. This is our Ian Potter Australian Wildlife Biobank, where we store our sperm and egg and DNA and tissue samples, and where we then can do our DNA research. So why is DNA useful? How does DNA help conservation research? Well, DNA is a way to measure genetic diversity in a threatened species. Okay. Why is genetic diversity important? All right, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, because that's a really important thing to understand. So why is genetic diversity important in conserving threatened species? Well, genetic diversity, or genetic variation, we know is valuable in resisting diseases, pests, and other stressors. So this is why we probably know a little bit more about resisting disease and our antibodies and the importance of our immune systems. We've learnt lots more over the last year. So we know that having a diverse immune system will help if there's a disease. So genetic variation can help maintain the health of a population. We also know from a variety of research that species with low genetic diversity, so species that are inbred, are less likely to breed successfully. So then they're more likely to go extinct. So we know low genetic diversity is bad for species. So conversely, species with higher levels of genetic diversity will do better. They'll breed better, and they're also better able to adapt to a changing environment and changing environmental conditions. And this is really important with climate change. So we don't know exactly what the changes in the environment may be, but if there's a variety of individuals in a population and they're all a little bit different to each other, then there's more likely to be one in that group that does better in a warmer climate, say. So we know genetic diversity helps animals adapt to changing environmental conditions. So we want the species in the environment, especially the frogs, to not only survive in their natural habitat, but to maintain their evolutionary potential, so that capacity to adapt to environmental change over the long term. So that's why taking measures of genetic diversity using DNA is really important in conserving threatened species, and why we include that in the research that we do. So this assessment of genetic diversity was recognised as something that was really important after the 2019 bushfires. So there was a big federal push to have a look at the species that were affected by the bushfires after the 2019 bushfires. And one of the many things that were put into place in many research outcomes was to assess the genetic diversity of some of the species that were affected by these bushfires. And we were involved, we've been involved in a number of those, and I'll talk a little bit about one of those priority species, the rather shy Latoria veroi, so Vero's frog. So if you have a look at the map on the right, all of those little tiny blue dots are all locations, sort of museum records of where the frog has been found down the southeast coast of Australia. And if you have a look at the red blobs on the map on the left, you can see that that's where the bushfires burnt large tracts of forest. So you can see that there was quite a lot of this species habitat was burnt during the fires. It's quite a common species and it's found in a lot of places, but a lot of the habitat was lost. So what we wanted to do is have a look and see where there is some genetic diversity in Latoria veroi. So we can't focus our attention everywhere, but if there's more bushfires in the future, or just to manage this species, we want to know where the genetic diversity is. So I did make this up. This is not actual data yet, but you can see that I've put in some frogs that are green inside and out. They're the general frogs that we find up and down the coast, but there's one that is all orange. So that population is a little bit different to the others. And then there's a couple of populations that are sort of a combination. They've got some of the diversity like in the orange population and some like in the all green population. So those ones probably have higher levels of genetic diversity. They're a mixture of the other ones, or have traits from both types. So when we start to look at the management of this species and how best to conserve populations, maybe even where to get nice diverse sperm and egg from that we could put in our biobank, we would make sure that we were picking populations from our all green section, from our all orange areas, and then definitely from those mixed diverse populations. So that's how doing a survey of the genetic diversity across the whole of that distribution will help us to make the management decisions. We can't manage the whole lot, but we know where to focus. And if there's bushfires, we know where we need to really make sure that there's blocks of forest are conserved or looked after to manage those really diverse frog populations. So we did something similar. We've done something similar for 4 priority species down the southeast coast in collaboration with a bunch of other researchers up and through from different museums and universities. So there were four quite broadly distributed species that we that we had lots of tissue samples from. So this is where we used our tissue samples that we already had in our collection. We couldn't go into the areas that had just burnt. Either the frogs were gone or it wasn't safe for us to go into. But because we've done these surveys over time and we've taken these little DNA samples and we've stored them and we have all the data connecting them to the location, we were then able to take our little toe tips and extract DNA and look at the genetic diversity of these species across a broad area, and we're just waiting for our data to come back to see the genetic diversity of those species. So we'll be looking at some of the more broadly distributed ones, and then that will help us to make decisions about the much rarer species as well, which we may not have as many samples of. So if you're interested in our collection and all of these samples that we've got in our collection, it is possible to have a look yourself. Our collections are all online there. You can search through our MV collections online. I've got the link up there, or you can just Google it. And there's information about the species. So we've got pages about each species, or you can even have a look at the nuts and bolts of what we have in our collection as well. If you want to go bushwalking and you're interested in finding out, identifying things in the field, then we also have a MV field guide that is free to download as well. So that's if you want to be out in the field identifying yourself as well. I get it. That's the best part of our day. And then if you're specifically interested in frogs, there's also the Frog ID app that was developed by the Australian Museum, and I think Karen is going to talk to us a bit more about that, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jo. I really liked to hear a bit more about the importance of the genetic diversity within a species as a really significant thing for their own well-being and something that needs to be considered in conservation. So thank you for explaining that. Our next speaker is Dr. Karen Rowe, and she is a research fellow at Museums Victoria, where her research into acoustic monitoring includes using citizen science to aid landscape scale monitoring of birds and frogs. Her research has been using both museum collections, field notes, field-based biodiversity surveys, and molecular genetics. Karen's worked in the US, in Indonesia and Victoria. So her research investigates how bioacoustics technology can improve our understanding of species distributions in the present, as well as how they change over time. So over to you. Thank you, Karen.
So as Kate mentioned, I'm just going to sort of wrap up today's talks with a project that we've just started within the last week, actually, looking at how we can understand better how populations of frogs in the alpine regions are surviving impacts of previous bushfires, and how climate change impacts may be exacerbating those fire impacts. And it may foreshadow some of the things that we're going to start seeing in Gippsland. So the project I'm going to talk to you about, I'm actually going to talk to you about two different ways that we're working with citizen scientists and local groups of community people in monitoring frogs. One is called Alpine Frogs A-Calling, and I'll explain a little bit about that project, but also I'll go in a little bit more detail about the citizen science app that Jo talked about called Frog ID, which we'll be incorporating into components of our Alpine Frogs A-Calling project. And this project is really came out of a partnership with Parks Victoria in Yarra Ranges and Lake Mountain Alpine Resort, which is very concerned about preserving the biodiversity in the areas that they're protecting. And we also have some collaborations with University of Melbourne on the bioacoustic and analysis components of that, which I'll talk to you about. This project was supported in part by the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife, and I'll show you some of the cool new equipment that we were able to purchase with a grant from their Community Conservation Fund. Now, I'm sure many of you remember the impacts of the Black Saturday bushfires, and some of the areas in the Alpine region that were impacted by that are the areas of Lake Mountain, which is one of the closest alpine areas to us in Melbourne here. And they're still finding the impacts of the bushfires are having impacts on their wildlife, I should say. And this is a photo actually taken from Lake Mountain just after the bushfires. And so one of the interests in this area is how are animals tracking over time. We know that there were declines in a lot of species in this area, but as populations recover, sometimes how they do so is not quite clear until years later. So we're really interested in trying to develop new ways of evaluating how populations are tracking over time. And that's where the acoustic technology comes in, because it allows us to couple with the data that Jane and Joe are collecting on populations on the ground, but it allows us to give sort of a longer term perspective on how populations are doing seasonally and annually, and then really let us hone in on identifying populations that need intervention in terms of management, but also in terms of understanding better how they're doing long term. Now, fire is an important factor that shapes landscapes, and recovery can take a long time, but that's particularly true in alpine regions. These areas grow very slowly, they recover very slowly. And when you have things like bushfires that recur on short intervals, but also coupled with climate change, you're sort of doing a 1-2 punch for these habitats, and it takes a long time to recover. And that's really where we're concerned, is the fire severity, the fire frequency, and how those changes and impacts are interacting with climate change. And so alpine regions in particular are really fragile ecosystems, and frogs within alpine ecosystems are very fragile as well. So it's really important to kind of keep an eye on how those populations are doing. So we know from climate change projections that elevation, high elevation areas are actually drying quicker than we are finding in other parts of the state. So they're drying faster than we're seeing in lower elevations, particularly in winter. And this winter, minimum temperatures are rising in winter, which is particularly important in alpine regions because it has follow-on effects for snowfall and snowpack, which often protects animals over the winter months. And so this is a real problem, not just in Australia, but also in the US, in Europe. And so we're sort of very carefully watching how these are affecting wildlife populations. As Joe and Jane mentioned, also chytrid is a problem, and a lot of diseases actually do better when temperatures are warmer. And so trying to figure out whether or not increasing temperatures is actually going to cause a rise in populations that are affected by chytrid is a really important concern for monitoring frog populations. And in these delicate habitats, bushfires actually wipe out a lot of natural predators, and feral animals can come in. And so those animals actually can have dramatic impacts on fragile habitats like bogs and fens up in alpine regions. And so this means all of these different factors together are really putting frog populations at risks at higher elevation. And so we're really interested in trying to keep track of those populations long term. So we started a project in a collaboration between Parks Victoria and Lake Mountain particularly, where we're monitoring some of these high elevation bogs for the frog species that are there. And the way that we're doing that is, in addition to doing surveys on the ground, we're also recording frog choruses over time. And so I've shown on the map here, hopefully you can see, it's not covered up by the pictures of us, the blue blobs that you see up there. So just to give you a context, this is actually in Lake Mountain Alpine Resort, and then Yarra Ranges National Park just goes over the top of that. And all of the little trails that you see are the foot trails that people can take as visitors of the park. And all those blue blobs are either alpine bogs or fens. Fen is the difference between the two is just whether or not there's connection to groundwater underneath, which I just learned not that long ago. And all the yellow dots that you see are areas that we're already been monitoring with Parks Victoria. And these are all what we call listening stations or survey stations, where we have automated recorders that we put out to listen to the frogs. So when a frog calls, we're listening and we're also recording. So whenever frogs call at these bogs, so this picture here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but hopefully you can. This is the edge of a bog here, and this post here is a listening station. And this little box right here is an audio recorder. And so here's a picture of up close of an audio recorder. And I have one here. I'll try, I can talk to you a little bit more about these as we have questions. But these little recorders have amazing little tiny microphones. So the little circle that you see on the right here is actually where the microphone is, and it's able to pick up and record the frogs calling from these bogs. And it's this information that we're able to figure out whether or not there are frogs calling in our recordings. And we're starting to build tools to allow us to do an automatic process for that. So what we're doing is what we call looking for frog calls. So Jane showed a picture at the beginning of her talk about the little, I guess it's purple and orange graph across the bottom. That's actually called a spectrogram. And that's how we visualize the sounds from the frogs that we hear. And so if you look on, this is a specialized program. It's actually an online website that we use called Arbamon, where we store the acoustic data, and then we're able to analyze the frog calls that we hear based on building what we call templates. So we can build a model of a frog call, and then we actually can use that model to scan all of our acoustic data and tell us, okay, which frogs are in this recording and which recordings have frogs in them. And so we use this to speed up the analysis of the frog calls within our data, because we're trying to put out recorders and do surveys essentially every day for weeks to months at a time. So we need some way to speed that process up. And so we use this software, and we use the tools we've created to build libraries of calls of frogs, because not all frogs in one species sound the same in every region. And frogs make unique vocalizations. So we're able to tell this call is this frog and this call is this frog. And we can then go back and map, okay, when are these frogs calling? Are they calling earlier in the year? Are they calling later in the year? How many days are they calling? All of those things we can pull out from that audio data. And then it allows us to kind of hone in a little bit more about the details of when frogs are using particular habitats. And then it also lets us identify which are priority sites for us to go and follow up on surveys. So we can find out whether they're breeding, how successful they're breeding, and things like that. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach. It's sort of a mass surveillance of the area. I'll show you, we actually just got these in yesterday. These are the latest and greatest of acoustic recorders. So we used to use the big boxes that you may have seen in the picture with Murray Littlejohn. We still sometimes use those handheld recordings. Oh, sorry. But this is the latest and greatest technology. So the new recorders we have are as big as my hand, and that's it. They're well camouflaged, and that's what it looks like inside. So we just have 3 little batteries and a little processor and an SD card. And we're able to collect vast amounts of data with this, which has really sort of opened up a new world of understanding of how our animals are moving across the landscape, because it allows us to survey many different places at the same time, but for very long periods of time. So in addition to knowing where frogs are, we can actually figure out where frogs aren't, which is a big critical part of that question. So because we've just started this project, we don't have any data. So hopefully we'll have some to share with you later on in the end of this year and maybe into next year. So stay tuned on that. But I do want to switch gears now and say a little bit about how you as an individual or as a family can get involved in monitoring frog populations across Australia. And this is really through what Joe mentioned, which is the Frog ID app. This is a free app that you can download on your phone, and it gives you a lot of information both about frog populations, but also it allows you to record frogs calling in your local area. And then you can upload those recordings to Frog ID, and then you'll get an identification from an expert on what species of frog it's likely that you've recorded. And then the information from your detections of those frogs goes up into a database that then helps us understand better how frog populations are doing across the country. And so it's a really easy and powerful way to help scientists, educational teachers, all kinds of different people understand better about frogs and learn how to help protect frog habitats throughout the state and throughout Australia. So Museums Victoria was a partner in developing this project, and we still have connections to this project as it moves forward. So just to give you a few screen captures of what it does tell you about frogs. It will actually tell you the frogs that are in your local area. So if you have a frog that you're interested in learning more about that you know occurs where you are, you can find out information about them. It gives you samples of the calls so you can listen to hear what they are as well. So it's a very interactive way to learn more about the frogs in your area. It lets you record and upload your frog calls, and then you will get identifications back as to what that call, that species is likely to be. And then, as I mentioned, all of the data that people have collected is uploaded into the Frog ID database, and that is shared with researchers as well as conservation agencies in terms of prioritizing and planning for protection for frogs across Australia. And so this is just a screen capture of the most recent data collected within the Frog ID dataset. And so there's just a quick capture of the website. They also have a lot more resources online if you're interested in learning more about frogs in general. How to build a frog habitat is one of their really great sections that they have, and even information about and coloring pages and stuff about frogs. So I think I'll leave it at that. And I guess we'll be happy to have questions from there.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yes, you've prompted quite a few questions by your talk. And I think there'll be lots of people who are interested also to see how they can get involved. And if they're not already, to be part of the recording and actually contribute to the understanding what's happening with frogs in their local area. So let's have a look at our questions. I'd like to start with one that we've got, which is actually, I think you covered it a little bit, Karen, in some of the things that you mentioned. The question is about another aspect of climate change. The question says, fires are an obvious concern, but what about the effect of rising temperatures in a warming world?
Yes, this is a big concern in lots of different landscapes around the world, really, because you have multiple different factors affecting ecosystems that can have pretty devastating effects on populations. So one of the big problems with fire is that, as Jane mentioned, you lose the vegetation that's really critical both for breeding and also the non-breeding seasons. But you get problems in alpine regions in particular, where the warming temperatures, particularly those minimum temperatures, causes snowpack to lessen and water availability to lessen. And so you get, and actually in the US, I know in particular, you get the subnivean space where a lot of animals survive over winter in these alpine regions is decreasing. And so the insulative properties of snow actually go down. And so you're seeing more stressors associated with the metabolic demands of animals to live in these really extreme environments already. And so when you have fire go through, you just basically remove a lot of the protections that those animals have in those unique habitats. And so there's lots of evidence to suggest that they're getting all kinds of things at the same time. And it's really sort of alarming to see how quickly these ecosystems are declining. So yeah, there's certainly competing and interactive and synergistic negative effects of both climate change and fire.
Any other comments, Joe or Jane, on that one about the effect of warmth? No? Or increased temperature? Okay. We have one question, which I think might have been in response to your talk, Jane. Litoria aureus sounded a lot like the growling grass frog, which I have also heard called the motorbike frog. Are they different?
They sound very similar. They're actually what's called sister species. So a long time ago, the growling grass frog was actually a subspecies of the golden bell frog, but quite a number of decades ago it was named its own species, and we're actually working on the growling grass frog in Melbourne. So the green and golden bell frog comes down through Gippsland to the Gippsland Lakes area, and that's the end of its distribution. And then you get the growling grass frog west of that across to Western Victoria. And the growling grass frog has also been severely impacted by chytrid fungus. it's also undergone huge declines. It was so common in Melbourne in the 1970s that it was used as a frog for student dissections at universities. It was so common, it was everywhere. And now it's a threatened species, and you don't find it in inner Melbourne. You find it now in the northern extent of the Mary River. We've been doing population genetics on this. So you find it kind of up in the more northern suburbs around the Mary River, down towards Werribee, and then down in southeast Melbourne. But other than that, it's pretty much disappeared in the inner Melbourne area. So yes, they're very similar.
Are there foreign frogs which are out competing native frogs?
In Victoria, it's no. If you head up into the tropics, there's the cane toad, of course, which is, I'd say yes. It's you know, the native frogs are really in trouble in areas where you find the cane toads. But in Victoria, we don't have foreign frogs competing. However, if you look in Melbourne, we have a frog called Latoria phalanx, which is a frog from Queensland and northern New South Wales, and often called the banana box frog. It comes down fruit boxes into Melbourne, and somehow it's a beautiful frog, a small green tree frog with a white lip stripe. And it's now established populations in and around Melbourne, like the Merri Creek and the in particular. And perhaps people have been releasing them from their banana boxes where they hitch a ride in the fruit, and they've established populations around Melbourne. So.
Thanks. Here are a couple about the bioacoustics and the recordings. This question says, for the call recordings, is there a way to only record when there's a call instead of just recording nothing for hours on end if there's you know, quiet periods?
They're sort of building that technology. So bat recorders do that because recording at high frequency takes up a lot of battery power, and it also takes up a lot of storage space because of that higher frequency. You're actually storing a lot more bits of information. So I wouldn't say that that's become a standard practice for things that are audible to us, so frog calls in particular. But I know that the team who work with AudioMoz have been developing ways to do that so that we can have trigger events so that it only records when there's a sound in a particular frequency range. So not yet, but hopefully in the future.
Great. And we have a question here about I think about the Frog ID app, whether it actually geotags the recordings.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why a lot of citizen science projects are on mobile phones, is because they collect all that data, which we call metadata, without you even knowing about it. So what happens is it'll record the location that you're in, the time of day. It'll have all of your user information linked to it, so they can, you know, if there's any questions about that recording, they can get in touch with you. And all that information is stored within the app itself because it's on your phone. And so all of that, you don't have to add extra data. So the way we would normally do field work is you'd have to go to a location, you'd have to write down, you know, this is the location, these are the conditions. A lot of that information is now stored just in the app itself. So it's happening without you even realizing it.
Cool. Now here's a question, I think maybe a follow-on for you, Karen, but I'm not quite sure that I understand. It says, do you have access to the MW Frog Census app? Melbourne, is that Melbourne Water?
Yes, so that is a separate app, and this one is a bit more of, so Frog ID focuses more about individual detections of frogs at particular locations, whereas the Melbourne Water is more of that, a census app. So you go to a particular location, like a water body, and then you do, I think it's a minute-long recording, and that provides information not just on a particular species, but also on all the other frogs that are in the area. And it'll also ask you to upload information about the type of vegetation you see. So I would say that there's sort of like the continuum of the Frog ID, which is a quick snapshot, this frog is here at this location, to the actual census, which is a sort of a more survey or census at that particular. So they're complementary.
Great. Oh, that's good to know. Good to understand the sort of difference between them.
Yeah.
How long and how frequently do you record using the audio moths?
Yeah, those are these ones. Yeah, the little, oh, sorry, hard to focus. Sorry. So each survey period varies based on the species that you're looking to record. And so for frogs, we did some pilot recordings in the Alpine region, and we generally record between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. And we do this special type of recording where it's 55 seconds on and 5 seconds off. It's because it takes about 5 seconds to write the file for the 55 seconds that it's done. And so that's pretty much continuous 5 hours every night. When we move into the next stage of the project, using the new recorders, we'll probably do some longer duration recordings and then isolate the time periods that are most effective at picking up frog calls. And then we'll focus on doing that, because we're really interested in being able to put the recorders out for long periods of time, but collecting data in the most efficient way possible. So unfortunately, the smaller the recorder is, the less data you can collect with the same number of batteries. And so we're trying to really hone in on the real sweet spot between how long and how many days in a row we can get. So it's generally in the evening for quite a few hours at the moment for frogs.
We have a comment here from Anna. She says, we have growling grass frogs in the Moonee Ponds Creek. Numbers have declined in the Jacana wetlands, seemingly in combination with an overgrowth of the common reeds. Any comments?
I'd say that it's difficult to tell whether it's specifically because of the reeds, but vegetation in the wetlands can have a really big impact on whether the habitat is suitable for frogs or not. What's called the microclimate created by various vegetation around and within water bodies is really important. Willows, weedy willows can be a real problem as well. It's hard to specifically say without knowing whether that is the reason. There could be all kinds of reasons, like loss of their overwintering habitat or feral predators that are in the area, or loss of some other condition that allows chytrid fungus to thrive. Because chytrid fungus, they've done a lot of research, chytrid fungus doesn't do well in more saline waters and in water that is sunny. So chytrid fungus likes shady, cool, freshwater environments. So if you get weed inundations in and around water bodies that create shadow, that can actually promote chytrid fungus infections. So it's hard to tell without knowing the situation.
And we have one from John here saying, I feel like Perrin's tree frog seems to be increasing around the Melbourne area. Is there any evidence for this?
You know, I was actually thinking that the other day. I was down the Yarra Bend Park and I was hearing Perrin's tree frogs, and I hadn't heard them down there before. It's hard to say without doing a big study to look at actually over the years, have they been increasing? But it's really possible. Some species do quite well in disturbed habitats and habitats that are changing. You just look at some of the native bird species like the noisy miners that do really well in some urban environments. And it might be that the Perrin's tree frog is doing a bit better in some environments than some of the other native species. But it's me guessing here, but I did notice that too when I was out the other day.
We've got a couple more questions about the different frog apps and the Melbourne Water app versus the Frog ID app. Someone here is asking whether they should actually be recording sightings in both of them.
I would say that there's not a lot of communication between the two apps. If you have the option to do both, I would certainly do both because it can benefit different types of conservation efforts. And the Frog ID app is a really quick, easy way to capture the data, whereas the Melbourne Water one is really going to directly go into conservation in these local areas. So if you have the option to do both, I would absolutely do both. I do both just because it gives the maximum amount of data to the most number of people who use it for different reasons, I guess.
Karen, I'm just wondering if you could share your last screen again that has the just the Frog ID, you know, the apps on it.
I can put them in the chat so that, because there's three different, there's the Melbourne Water one, there's the Frog ID one, and there's also the MV app. I can try and find all three of those and put them in the chat so people can see.
That'd be great. Yep. I think that's all the questions that we had online. I just had a general question, I guess, for all of you. I mean, we've been talking more about the links between human health and the health of our environments. And I was just wondering whether there are any links that you can think of between healthy frogs and healthy people. That's a big question, I know, but would anyone like to comment on that?
I mean, perhaps in a more vague way, is that having healthy frogs and nature is just a wonderful thing, and of importance for human health for all kinds of reasons. I think last year when we were all in many weeks of lockdown, it just made me appreciate being able to go out to some of the natural areas that I missed out on during that time, natural areas within Melbourne, within the urban environment, and listening to the frogs and listening to the birds and nature. It's really important, and I really missed that during that period, so it made me think about that.
Great. Any final comments, Jo?
Yeah, I agree. It was certainly that was really important, getting out along Merri Creek, and I did my lots of Frog ID recordings, did that every evening, so I was able to hear as the different species of frogs started calling at the end and beginning of winter. But I think also frogs are often called, they're the canary in the coal mine in lots of ways, because they're very sensitive to changes in the environment and pollution. So I think if we can make sure that the frogs populations are healthy, then that's a good indicator that the habitat itself is also doing fine.
Any final thoughts, Karen? Thanks for posting those links.
No, I can't agree more. I think you tend to want to help preserve things that are around you that you notice, and so spending time outdoors has such massive benefits to mental health and sort of just feeling of place. And I think that people are now realizing more and more how important it is for health to have healthy waterways and healthy habitats for animals to thrive. And so, yeah, all of those things together, I think, really improve human health.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for all your really interesting work. 3 fantastic talks interlinked to really give us a bigger picture of what's happening for frogs and how we can find out how they're going. So really appreciated learning about your approaches, your work, and getting a little sense of what it's like to be out in the field as well. If people have enjoyed this talk and are interested to find out more, we have more on our website here, the Climate Environment section on the Museums Victoria website. And I'd like to invite you along to our next talk, which is called The Cozy Project. The Cozy Project is all about how to stay warm in winter. we're getting practical hints for both homeowners and renters about solutions from simple draft busting to more substantial improvements that you can make on your home to save energy and to stay warm in winter. So that's on Friday the 4th of June, the day before World Environment Day. So I do hope you can join us then, and please get the word out to other people who you think might want to come along to that. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.